episode 2 of Conversations. Hope everybody enjoyed episode 1. Just want to give a shout out and a thank you to everybody who did give episode 1 a listen, and the people who gave me some constructive criticism and feedback on that first episode. That's very much appreciated, and hopefully I'll be able to apply some of that information that you gave me to make this an even better podcast moving forward. Week 1 of college football is in the books now. Hopefully everybody enjoyed that. I know we shared the picks for the college football playoff last week. I had the opportunity to take a long weekend visit up to Toronto, and I can tell you that it is not as difficult to watch college football games there as some may believe. I had a lot of people ask me when I told them I was going up to Toronto last weekend whether I had considered the difficulty of finding games that were going to happen over the weekend, and I can come back and confidently tell you that as long as you find a place that shows sporting events, that they will have an opportunity to show you the big games that are happening over the weekend. So spent some time in the afternoon watching the Ohio State-Texas game. There were a lot of people watching Premier League soccer at the same time, but they did give us a big screen, so I had an opportunity to watch it just like I would in the States, and got an opportunity to watch some of the later games as well in the hotel room. So I can say with certainty that Toronto definitely has a following for that kind of activity, but I was really surprised at the baseball that was on in the sports bars that we visited. I was impressed with the amount of games that were on throughout the weekend. It seems like there's a really good baseball culture there. Had an opportunity to get it to a Blue Jays game as well, and that was a packed crowd there on Sunday afternoon. So good on you, Toronto. Baseball seems to be your thing amongst the competing hockey games that you're obviously known for. So that's good to know. And for anybody who has a chance to visit, you will not be disappointed in your ability to find some games to watch on the side. But don't want to focus too much on that. We've got a lot to cover in today's episode. This is going to be the first weekend, I guess you could say, where we've got both college football and the NFL on the slate. So we'll go ahead and we'll cover both of those things. For college football, I always think that week 1 is an opportunity for people to have some overreactions to what they see after some limited gameplay. Obviously, we're just one game through the season for most teams, and so we'll take a look at some teams that have some hot takes that have already been made about them, and I'll break those down and give you my analysis on whether or not we should maybe pump the brakes on those overreactions or if there's really something behind them. And then we'll shift to the NFL as we head into the week 1 of their schedule and cover a couple of topics that came out this week. It's kind of a poor week for the NFL consumer, so we'll get into that a little bit later here. But diving right into college football, great weekends that we got from week 1. A lot of the big games did not disappoint. They were close for the most part. We did have an upset that I think took a lot of people by surprise, and we will cover both of those teams in our overreaction takes. But before we get to those games, I do want to start with one team that maybe I'm creating the overreaction. I don't know. I haven't heard a ton of information about the South Florida Bulls since their big win over Boise State on Thursday last week, but do want to start with them because the question or the overreaction that we'll assess here is South Florida now the favorite from the G5 group to make the playoff, given that they knocked off Boise State, which was essentially the betting favorite to be that team this year. And just to be able to clarify here how I'm going to assess this, if I agree with the overreaction take, we're going to give it a green light. We're going to say, go ahead. It's not an overreaction. It's reality. If we would need to pump the brakes on the overreaction, we'll give it a yellow light, a caution, maybe let's see what happens before we buy into the take completely. And if I disagree with the take, we'll give it a red light. We'll say no, we're gonna completely axe that one and let's get ourselves back onto stable footing. So that's how we're gonna rate these. And again, circling back then to South Florida, are they the team now that we need to look at from the G5 as potentially the favorite? And with this one, I think we are at a yellow light there. I think it's a little bit too early to call the Bulls the favorite. I think that they did show that they are a team that will be a competitor in the American Conference this season, as long as Byron Brown is healthy. He obviously showed off his skills in that game against Boise State. They had a lot of trouble containing him, both with his legs and with his arm. And as long as he's healthy, South Florida's offense is going to be potent enough to be a competitor in the American this year. But there's a couple other teams that are going to be difficult to beat in that conference, Memphis and UTSA specifically. But that conference is it's known for its parity, so it's going to be difficult for South Florida to run through the schedule that they have. And I guess even quicker than finding out whether or not they're for real within the conference schedule, we're going to be able to find that out this weekend as the Bulls have a big game against interstate rival Florida, which will really give us an indication as to whether or not the Bulls are one of the better teams defensively in the American Conference, or if Boise State just has bigger issues offensively than we could have even imagined based on that first game last Thursday. So we'll give the Bulls a yellow light here after week one. Let's pump the brakes on that overreaction. Moving on, and this one is from the biggest game of the weekend last week, the number 1 versus number 2 battle, Texas versus Ohio State. Is Texas an overrated team? And maybe more specifically, is Arch Manning and the hype that was surrounding him coming into the season overrated? I think in this case, you also have to give this a yellow. Arch Manning is a guy who's only had a few starts under his belt now. You know, this is a guy who is still trying to figure things out. And last weekend, he went up against a very creative defensive coordinator in Matt Patricia, who I think is making fans in Columbus very happy with what he was able to do against the Texas offense. You know, the thing about Patricia is that with him coming from the NFL, he's used to being able to dial up some creative packages with his defenses, and that's not always something you can do at the college level just based on the personnel that you're dealing with. But in Ohio State, Patricia has a defense and a personnel that is capable of doing some of the things that he may normally have to reserve for the next level. And that was something I think that really shone through in the game last weekend. The Buckeyes were really making Arch Manning uncomfortable. I think at the same time, though, there was a little bit of feeling it out from both teams. And I'm not sure Steve Sarkisian wasn't protecting Arch Manning to some extent. Because at the end of the day, the fact that this game was close really means that it's not going to totally affect either team's chances of making or missing the playoff. There's still way too much season left, and the fact that it was a one-score game throughout the entirety of it, I think, has most people thinking that both of these teams are still going to be a factor moving forward. So the overreaction is Texas, a team now that you have to worry about making the playoff, or they maybe not as good as what people thought they were, as Arch Manning, maybe a little bit overrated. I think both of those things you're going to have to pump the brakes on. There's way too many games left for Arch to show that he really does have the talent to be a Heisman Trophy contender. And even if he's not, there's enough talent there on the Texas squad that they're going to be a factor in the SEC this season. So then moving on then to Ohio State, what about them? Are they a team that maybe jumped into the conversation as perhaps the best team in the country? And this might not be an overreaction. I think there were a lot of people who had Ohio State as one of the best teams in the nation already coming into the game. But there were question marks, definitely, about whether Ohio State was going to be able to replace the number of starters that have left for the NFL and how Julian Sand would look more specifically. And I think in both cases, Ohio State passed with flying colors. I actually think that it's not an overreaction. Ohio State may be one of the best teams. It was a small sample size that we're seeing against the Texas defense that is supposedly pretty good. But what I saw from Julian Sand was a guy who was making all of the throws that he needed to make. And there were actually instances, a couple that I remember in the second quarter, where he put the ball right there to guys like Jeremiah Smith and I believe Max Clare, and the ball just dropped right out of their hands. And that's not on the quarterback. That's on the wide receiver. But what it's showing is that this guy is able to make the throws. He was put into a position where he's making his first start against the number one team in the country. He has a lot of expectation both from the fan base and from the coaching staff. And I think as a guy who had not started a game in college, he looked about as good as you could look. Now, Ohio State obviously was doing, I think, similar things to Texas offensively, where they weren't putting Sand in a position where he had to be superhero. But you could have said that about Will Howard at many points last season. And so that's the benefit that you have playing at Ohio State at quarterback, is that you don't have to be Superman. You have to be a guy who can make the throws and let your skill position players do the work once they have the ball in their hands. And based on 60 minutes of play so far, it looks like Sand is going to be a guy who's going to be able to do that for Ohio State. So I had the Buckeyes not making the Big Ten title game as I expressed last week, but based on that first game against Texas, it looks like they are certainly going to be in the conversation for the Big Ten title game this season, and I might be eating my words come that Penn State and Illinois game later in the season. So moving on to one of the other games this weekend that was looked at as one of the biggest of the week, the LSU-Clemson game. So LSU made the biggest jump of any team in the top 10. They're now up to number 3 in the AP poll. So the question is is LSU the best team in the SEC? Right now they're sitting there as the best team. The big win over Clemson propelled them up the rankings. But I think we do need to pump the brakes on this one. The LSU, they were in a position to be able to have a big win over Clemson on the road, which was always going to impress a lot of people if they were able to get it done. Where I'm a little bit concerned from their end is that they were only able to score 17 points in this game. It was a situation where Clemson was in the game for the entirety as well. I think this was definitely a toss-up from the beginning, and if this game were played 9 more times, you may have had a 50-50 split over 10 games between these two teams. So I think that while it's a big win for LSU, and it certainly will help them more moving forward to have won this game than I think it would have had Clemson won the game, I'm not sure I'm ready to say that the Tigers from the SEC are the best from that conference. There's still a lot of talent there that they're going to have to face moving forward, and I have my concerns about LSU making it through the SEC season in a position to actually get to that title game. So we'll give them a yellow. I need to see a little bit more from them before I would call them the best team in the SEC. But moving on from that one, a team that really has brought up some serious concerns now from a lot of people, including possibly most significantly its own fan base, is the Alabama Crimson Tide. The Crimson Tide were 14-point favorites coming into the game against Florida State last weekend and ended up losing by that amount, which was a massive swing in expectations. And the bigger issue with the Crimson Tide is, like LSU, an offense that was supposed to be quite potent this season, at least that was the perspective that I had, only scored 17 points. And so the question is Alabama in serious danger this year? Are they actually even a team that we should be considering a playoff contender? And I think this one really teeters on the edge of being a green versus a yellow. From the perspective of people who would say, yeah, that's a real take. Alabama is not a good team. We saw it. They've got problems at the quarterback position. And bringing Ryan Grubb back into the fold didn't seem to have the intended effect that I thought it would with Kalen DeBoer's offense. And I can see that perspective for sure. But where I am a little bit hesitant here is that I actually thought Florida State was going to be a factor this season in the ACC. I think that they're a better team than people were giving them credit for. That 2-10 record had a lot to do with that. They came in as a non-ranked team entering the season. But this is a team that was due for a bounce back. They certainly were not going to have the season they had last year. We're talking about the Seminoles, of course. And Thomas Castellanos backed up his words. I think that may have been the thing that had people worried that Florida State was going to get wiped off the floor by the Crimson Tide in this game, is that, you know, when you have a guy coming in and talking smack about a team that historically has been a perennial contender for national titles, it usually doesn't end well for you. But Castellanos was as advertised. He gave the Crimson Tide defense a lot of trouble and backed up what he had been saying all summer about them. So you got to give a lot of credit to Florida State and Castellanos for that performance. I don't think they're out of the water by any means yet. They still have some tough games coming up this season, so I don't know that I would put Florida State in contention quite yet for that playoff spot, but it is certainly a concern right now that Alabama may not have, once again, the team capable of competing in the SEC and thus competing for a playoff spot. So that one is definitely on the fence. I can see it going both ways, that it may be a slight overreaction at this point, but it also may not be with the amount of talent and depth that exists in the SEC this season. So these last two are not from the biggest games of the weekend. They're more so the hot topic, one of the hot topics of the offseason, as well as a team that was supposed to be a contender in their conference, but really has not looked good at all. And we'll start with that one. That's the Kansas State Wildcats. For the second week in a row, they did not look great. This time it was defensively. They were nearly knocked off by one of the wrong Dakotas in the FCS division. If you have a close game with North Dakota State or South Dakota State, sometimes you can look the other way on that one, as they're perennial FCS contenders. But this one was just North Dakota, and the Wildcats survived by a single field goal. And I think there's problems on both sides of the ball for Kansas State right now. It's not just a singular issue with them. It appeared like it could have been a singular issue after the first game against Iowa State this season, but it just looks like the Wildcats aren't quite what we thought they were going to be coming into the season. And so it's interesting to see, because Chris Kleiman has had one of the most consistent teams in the Big 12. A lot of people lean on that when they're trying to choose who they think is going to win the Big 12, because there's so much parity there. But I certainly think that it's a solid take that the Wildcats may have been overrated this year, and you might have to look elsewhere in the Big 12 if you're trying to, after 1 week or 2 weeks in their case, predict who could make it out of that conference and into the playoff this year. And then lastly, and this one is mostly based on the fact that they were getting a lot of attention coming into the season, but I'm not sure that anybody had super high expectations for them, but some did. The North Carolina Tar Heels. How did the Bill Belichick experiment go? And as we saw on Monday evening, it went very poorly. It was a situation that was quite hard to watch at times on both sides of the ball. It appears that the Tar Heels don't quite have what they're looking for. quite yet at the quarterback position, and then possibly more interesting when you're thinking about Belichick and some of the people that he's brought along to be on the staff at North Carolina. The defense was atrocious, and it was one of those situations where you look at it from a bird's eye view, and in the off season there was a lot of chatter that didn't have a lot to do with football, and you just start to wonder whether or not those types of situations can be overcome. If the thought was if anybody could do it, it would be Bill Belichick, but I think that it's a green light here, so a non-overreaction, just a good take that the experiment is not going to end well here. The Tar Heels look like a team that are going to struggle to make it to the postseason at all, let alone contend for the ACC title or a playoff. I think those two things at this point are almost off the table. You're starting to look at how do we get to 6 wins if you're down in Chapel Hill. So unfortunate for people who were hoping that Belichick would be able to create some buzz, not only for the school in particular, but for the conference that's kind of looking for some additional teams to step up outside of Clemson and Miami and maybe Florida State. But I don't think we're going to get that this year from the Tar Heels. So that's all I've got. So if you do have a particular team or a particular take that you'd like me to take a closer look at, I'm happy to continue this in future episodes. All you'd have to do is send a note to conversationspod@gmail.com or interact with us on Facebook or Twitter, or as I said last week, eventually we will have an Instagram as well. So we'll get all those socials up for you in due time and make sure we share them with you. But for the time being, if you've got something and you've got a hot take that you'd like to see, is it overreaction or not, according to Becks, give us a shout at the email. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to shift gears a little bit here from college football to the NFL as we head into week 1 of their season. And before we get there, the NFL consumer had a couple of topics or news stories that broke this week that don't really benefit the consumer, unfortunately. The first one is interesting. It's something that you can't really blame the league or the powers that be for going into this, but for those that are turned off by the high cost of things like NFL Sunday Ticket, or in some cases, just the streaming services that offer the games outside of the over-the-air network games. Some bad news came through this week that the leading streaming service, Stream East, was shut down, and 2 individuals responsible for the operation of that site were taken into custody, and so it looks like the run of Stream East has met its end here. It's always interesting because these things do pop up, and there likely will be another one. But it was a site where, despite it being a pirate site, so one that was illegally streaming not just NFL action, but other sporting events like Premier League and Champions League soccer, that it was almost openly talked about to the point where people knew it wasn't necessarily the legal route of being able to consume these games, but it was the route that people were going to utilize. So, when something gets that big, it really is just a matter of time. But it is going to be interesting that it was shut down, or at least the announcement was made just a day before the season began. And I don't think that's a coincidence at all. I think that it's one of those examples where when an organization that is responsible for cracking down on these types of things wants to make a statement, they can do that. They can say, hey, we knew this was something that was going on. We wanted to make sure that we had the right scenario set up at the right time so that not only could we have it be a slam dunk in terms of the prosecution and cracking down on this, but we could make a statement in terms of when this information was being released so that everybody knows, don't do it again. I think it's a warning sign to the next one that decides to come up that the capability is there to track these guys down. So rest in peace, Stream East. It's going to be an interesting season now with people trying to find alternate ways outside of the legal ones to stream their games. But perhaps in slightly more ethical news, but this one's just as interesting, is that the NFL Network has announced that the Red Zone channel, which is known for 7 commercial-free hours of NFL football, for the first time in its 18-year history, I believe, will be having full commercials on that channel. And this one to me was actually quite sad, because the NFL Red Zone channel is a little bit of a polarizing channel for people. My wife in particular, and I've heard other people have these takes on the NFL Red Zone channel that it's actually too overwhelming and it gives them a headache. So some people don't like it, but for others, and myself included, the NFL Red Zone channel has been the answer to not having every game available to you, right? You've got your over-the-air games, you've got your streaming options, but for the most part, more than half the league every week is playing exclusively through NFL Sunday Ticket if you're not in market. And so this was an opportunity to get a holistic view of the league, to see the best plays being made in terms of scoring plays, and not have to constantly bounce around. It was a lot of work being done for you, that you could go and you could just sit back and relax on a Sunday. And that's still going to happen, but I think that it's a dangerous game to be playing, to start to slowly but surely incorporate ads into something that has been built on the premise of not having ads. And it should not be left out of this conversation that ESPN recently acquired the rights to the NFL Network and thus the rights to NFL Red Zone channel. And I think it really just points to some of the challenges that ESPN has been having. They're looking for that silver bullet. They're looking to try to bring back some of the content that they were known for, which is the live sports, in place of some of these live talk shows that are struggling in today's media age. But when you're going to do something like bring in a beloved channel like Red Zone and then almost taint it with the commercials from the onset of the acquisition, I think that it's setting a bad precedent. I don't think that anybody is blind to this, that this is ESPN acquiring and then simultaneously adding in their spin, which is to put some ad dollars behind this. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with Red Zone moving forward. I'd love to come back to this topic later in the season to see what the ratings look like on this show with ads in the fold, because I think that it could take a hit, especially with it being a polarizing product already, where you've got people who, may not like it for one reason or another. Is it going to completely turn them off? Very possibly. It may also, depending on what it looks like, may also turn off the big fans of it, like myself, that love the fact that you can just watch football and you don't have to be bothered by the constant interruptions that happen if you're trying to watch full games. So that'll be something to keep an eye on, maybe a future conversation. But the good thing is we've got football back. We've got pro football back starting Thursday evening. College football now in full swing, heading into week 2. So it's going to be a great weekend to just sit back. It's the first time in 5 weeks, I believe, that I'm going to have a chance to sit on my own couch and watch some of the action that unfolds this weekend. So I'm excited, and I hope you are too. And we'll go ahead and we'll break all the action down next week as well. I'm anticipating that there's going to be some more football conversations that are happening. But until that time, enjoy the games and take it easy, Shuckers.